It gives me pleasure to introduce our next guest. It'll also be a kind of double, a sort of invented double act. But I want to start by introducing Barbara Vanderlinden. The context of this, as you could tell, we obviously started 100 years ago with this idea of the Bauhaus as a kind of ground zero. We're now moving closer to the present, but still 20 years ago. And actually 20 years ago, I remember buying a book, and it was a white book, and it had very large black letters on the front. And it was designed by the then designer of the moment, Bruce Mau. And at that point, somehow, I think anyone who's interested in graphic design just bought books because they were designed by Bruce Mau. But once you got beyond the front cover, you realize that this was actually a very extremely interesting proposal, and the book was called Laboratorium, and it was related to a research exhibition that had been curated by Barbara Vanderlinden and Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and it was looking at the relationship between two kind of mythical spaces of creation, one being the artist's studio and the other the scientist or the scientific laboratory. And the possible resonances, the possible conversations, the possible similarities, but of course there's the dissonances between the two. And so we thought, Victoria Fowles and I thought this would also be a really interesting moment for us to reflect with Barbara on the 20 years since that seminal research exhibition and publication, because of course in that time so much has happened, but also, and perhaps it's a provocation to bear in mind, that even in that time, in the last 20 years, the role that science has played, or had played, in a cultural, imaginary sense, has maybe, in some sense, been replaced by technology. Now, of course, you could say, well, technology and science are the same thing, or one is a subset of the other, but maybe not. And so it gives me great pleasure at this point to welcome Barbara Vanderlinden, and we look forward to hearing more about the Laboratorium project. Thank you.
Thank you, Shulman. Thank you, Victoria and Fatima, for inviting me and for helping this to organize this, Fatima. So 20 years later, I'm speaking of Laboratorium, and I decided to write a text because I've spoken so much a long time ago about this exhibition, and one ends up getting into a system of repeating what one knows. So I think besides the images, I'm going to follow my text because it seems to me that the images will lead us to talk about a lot of projects. Each of them are very interesting within the exhibition. There were more than 66 projects in the exhibition, but I want to focus on the questions we had and the content that I think would be of relevance today for your discussion, but also for, in general, for us thinking about exhibitions. So this exhibition was definitely an exhibition that, as Schumann said, wanted to reflect on the place of work, the place of creation, the place of investigation or research, but we very much saw the exhibition as our question, meaning how could we make this space of the exhibition a fruitful, investigative platform. So I'm going to put on my glasses. This is not a handicap that I have since 20 years now. I have now to work with this up and down. But anyway, so the question is, what is Laboratorium? Of course, the answer in this case is very simple. It's the exhibition we did in '99 in Antwerp. A year before that, in '98, preparations had started in Antwerp for the celebration of 400 years anniversary of Anton van Dyck, the Antwerp painter's birth. The organizers of that event had invited me to conceive of a contemporary art program. What inspired me was Van Dyck's studio in Antwerp. Like many artists all over Europe, Van Dyck in the 17th century had begun to consider the studio as a basic instrument of his art, whereby the studio was not just a location, but intrinsic to his context of working. It was a place where inquiry, experience, production, and education were combined. Together, these functions underpinned the artist's process, temperament, inquiries, and work, but also the education of other apprentice artists. As a studio, it was both a school, a production, and an investigation place. The precursor, maybe, of the 20th century Bauhaus, which developed a curriculum that brought together the arts and crafts with an emphasis on form as the embodiment of ideas, and the workshop the place to produce them. This seemed in great contrast to the situation the artist studio in 1999, which we had experienced from the artists we met. At that time, the studio seemed to be dead, and artists had moved away from the studio-based practice. Many young artists were working from place to place while traveling through a booming, recently at that time, international booming art world, which, as Hans Uri at the time said, made the artist almost like voluntary migrants from one exhibition to the other. With the internet and mobile computer in place, they had transformed their studios a lot, not all, but most of them, the young ones, into mobile studios, or often because of economical limitations. The communication and the workspace became almost the cafe and the mobile laptop. This was new. We only bought one 5 years before that time, and we only were just having internet and mobile phones. This creative aspect, this inspired me to investigate the nature of the studio in contemporary art practices and other related artistic disciplines. The creative aspect of my role as the curator led me to propose to the organizers of Antwerp Van Dijk event to propose an alternative to the traditional object-oriented art exhibition by creating an exhibition that took form for a year-long functioning studio. I fulfilled the aim by setting up a program with a series of exceptional studio exhibition projects that were carried out in defunct office spaces throughout the city of Antwerp. These culminated and merged in June of the same year in Laboratorium, a large-scale interdisciplinary exhibition project in which the artists and studio and the scientific laboratory were explored on the basis of various concepts and disciplines. It brought together the work of 66 artists and scientists devoted to research and experimentation, and it was co-curated in collaboration with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the section Laboratorium. In a way, the exhibition was a paradigmatic case involving the possibilities of art today to combine theoretical, artistic, sociological, scientific, and other research with a feel for the way that aesthetic form can influence collective paths. The project had complex referential context, but it also developed on a highly self-reflexive and deeply playful exercise of the basic human capacities of perception, affect, thought, expression, and relation. Multiple other examples of such type of art projects could be given. At the time, somebody like, for example, Marco Pellerin was already running his microlab, where groups of artists were living under conditions of isolation and insulation. They carried out investigation into the human and animal migration, climate change, and the use of electromagnetic spectrums, all within the enclosed environment of a nomadic laboratory that finally was shown at Documenta in 1997. That yet another case that we found very relevant at the time was the email forum that Jordan Crandall had created, where the unfolding of a thematic debate was used to sound out the geographically disjunct social relations between the participants, generating a knowledge of a globalizing society, which in turn contributed directly to the thematic study. In each case, the initial artistic act consisted in establishing the environment and setting the parameters for a larger inquiry. In the case of Laboratorium, the larger inquiry was the laboratory, or / I will say from now on, studio itself, and by extension, the artist's place of work, which is also a laboratory, one of creativity. From a well-defined located place to a situation of dispersion in which one can no longer define where the actual location of the laboratory or studio is, the exhibition inquired about the nature of this laboratory and these studios. What is the nature of this knowledge science building site? From the architectural itself, the laboratory, in a sense, beginning with the lower regions in the basement, in secret spaces that restrict and isolate from the outside, such as, for example, the alchemist laboratories. Laboratories moved in the early modern period to gentlemen quarters and mutated to a form of workshop, a craft-dominated late 19th century factory where glass was hand-blown, tools were machined by hand, and the world, in some sense, was to be gathered in from the extremes of empire as physics strove to imitate storms, electrical discharges, glaciers, and volcanoes. Thick, immovable walls built to isolate sound and other vibrations from the precision work within also served symbolically to isolate and render permanent the domination of the experimenter. Then came the laboratory of the Second World War and the post-war years. The laboratory as centralized factory, as large-scale production. In the last few decades of the 20th century, the laboratory was dispersed in various complex ways through networks of institutions, personal equipment, and data flows. The isolated, centralized laboratory of physics had begun to dissolve at the time in 1999, at least in large-scale experimentation. There is a parallel history, but not exactly the same, that could be written about the various types of artist studios, how they had evolved through history. At the point in 1999, there was no research done on how the artist had reorganized his own work and thinking in terms of location and its studio, except, I think, for the work of Peter Gallison and Jones, which was called the Studio Laboratorium. But what was clear is that also for the production of art, a similar development could have been seen. We come from the so-called romantic idea of the studio under the roof in Paris to the same evolution that happened after the war, that artists started to enter into industrial buildings, into large-scale production places. It's not insignificant to notice that Andy Warhol created a factory. The concept of factory became the symbol of production of art after the Second World War. That happened in the science context, but it also happened in the art context. It dramatically changed the scale of art, actually, also. It's when we see large-scale paintings emerging and so on. So we felt this is interesting. We need to look at the doors, at the roof, at the tables, at everything that affects this production of art. This is a very simplistic way if you look at the architecture, but it does play a role. But the architecture, of course, had become much more complex. And you probably speak of more complex architecture if you speak of the one of today. But at that time already, the notion of a dispersed context was central to what we were experiencing as the critical intellectual environment where artists were working or investigating. So one of the, it's intrinsic, the idea of location to the laboratory. Even if the location is dispersed, somehow that seemed a central element that kind of, one could say that even if all the proposals were very different, that connected them conceptually. It's also one of the other things that we acknowledged and we saw was that the laboratory is a dynamic and always in flux. If we look through history, there is no one form of a laboratory. And probably in the future, we have to be open for many different forms of studios and work sites and so on. That is not only it's in constant mutation. So we shouldn't think that even the dispersed laboratories of today that have no single central site are to be considered the end state of laboratory development. Laboratories are moving in the treatment of new forms of visual display. The laboratory may slide between science and art. In its research function, the laboratory often mediates between military, industrial, and scientific sectors, constantly altering in form and function, in scale and scope. But this is not a reason to halt the analysis, to stop talking about the object of the laboratory itself. At any given time, it is extremely useful to ask what counts as a laboratory and the closely related question of who counts as an experimenter. We can surely ask what a laboratory is today, or where it is heading, where it has recently been, or where it was in the more distant past. Just when we organized the exhibition in 1999, deep space data had just been put online and students had been sorting through it to find previously undiscovered supernovas. Scientists were asking, what kind of laboratory is that? And where should one say it is located? What was clear in 1999 when we researched the nature of the laboratory is that we thought it would be an error to think of the laboratory in some way as frozen, as having a definite definition that picks it up once and for all times. The show's ambition was to represent this movable laboratory and to stage the relation between the networks of artists, dancers, writers scattered across the urban territory in Antwerp. The exhibition, I'll show some, how does it work here? Okay, so the exhibition was across the city of Antwerp. The city of Antwerp, like any city in the world, has many, many laboratories. In that case, in 1999, we estimated there should have been like 300 laboratories in the city. Anything in our society today, even then, is what we could see is that we actually live in a laboratory. When you go to the cash withdrawal machine, you put in your cards, we already did that at that time, you contribute data, and these data start to produce facts in order to be analyzed. So we thought the exhibition had this, fundamental question about whether we would be in the laboratory or we would be showing the laboratory. That would be outside of the laboratory. And that was the fundamental paradox of which Bruno Latour said, that is the paradox of the exhibition itself. So basically, the exhibition was incapable to show the laboratory. The laboratory was never shown in scientific, historical context, neither. How can you show that two planets are colliding when these experiments are exactly done every day by scientists? You cannot show this. These are mathematical experiments. There are some zones you just cannot put in the exhibition. And still, nonetheless, I think it was Hans and I, challenge of trying to find out whether this field this place we were working with the exhibition, how could it be a productive place in terms of producing, contributing to this inquiry. So we decided that the exhibition would be spread all over the city, that it would be, people could visit with bikes into the laboratories, but they also could, the artists were invited to, in these large towers and empty spaces throughout the city, to actually establish their own studio. So I invited already artists a year before that time, and then they stayed over. We also had the Photography Museum as our what we called relay center, because the images of the photography and the text or anything that was spoken during the exhibition was immediately feeded back into our relay center. So here the relay center is day one, hour zero, and the screens are empty. But this is still the empty exhibition, but artists already brought in ideas. We already started to photograph. People started to send in images. And during the process, this location, which was the exhibition, became the office. So the artist Michel François proposed that instead of us having an exhibition for an an office for an exhibition, the exhibition itself should be the office, of course, if we continue with this paradox. And the book was made during the whole 3 months that the exhibition was on. Bruce Mau installed a large wall that kind of moved through this relay center, and every day images were flowing in. I mean, this is all normal now, but at the time, this was very exciting. Pages were made based on templates that Bruce had created, and the content of the exhibition immediately, like in 24 hours, got into the book, and the book came out. And so the book was constantly being produced over the whole time of the exhibition. Pages and pages and pages emerged. And at the opening, Bruno Latour organized his Theater of Proof, which was, I would say, a review of the history of science experiments, like this is the experiment of the bacteria of, as many scientists, when they study or when they find something, they are dependent on money and finances, and they have to convince society, either politicians or their universities, to show why their research needs to be funded and to be advanced. So there exists this idea that there is a theatrical representation of what science does. Bruno Latour called it the Theater of Proof, and showed us throughout 150 sessions how science had proved what it does in a public way. This was the public laboratory in a way. It was a form of lecture. We also invited artists to participate in this. This is Xavier Leroy, who, as a dancer and a biologist, specialized in cancer research also, gave a lecture about his cancer research in a dance form. I guess this is the instruments of Laboratorium, historical laboratoriums collected by the Oldenburg University. And so, you know, instruments are very interesting and very important in laboratories, because whenever a new knowledge emerges in the context of scientific research, almost always that will be the creation of a new tool. This is one. This is another one. This is the Galileo experiment of falling bodies. Very essential experiment. We redid it. So we showed these crucial instruments of science where knowledge transforms technology. This is a very primitive thing because it's a very old one, but it went through also the Talking Heads experiment, which was about language and computer. This is Jason Rhodes, who just sending us images from every window that he saw during the time of our exhibition, because his studio was all of these places which he saw. So I can go on and on through many of these, but I'll go a little bit quicker maybe to stop by at Francesco Varela, which is what is called the most portable laboratory. It's a self-made laboratory. It's when you meditate, you're actually in the minimal space you can imagine where an investigation can happen, and any perspective is possible in this. So he proposed this do-it-yourself laboratory, the Laboratory of Doubt of Carsten Huller, and it went on and on. I mean, there are many, many projects in this project. But I think the most interesting thing is that what I want to give as the end is that this exhibition, we attempted to really not tell the story only about the laboratory. We knew that something was changing in the condition of work that was affecting what we did, and that it was going to enable us also to connect more things, be it science and art, but not only that, also the movability of it. It was connecting us from Antwerp, in this case, to many places in the world. So to learn to work, to learn to think an exhibition in this dispersed site, to conceive of an exhibition as a device in the Foucault sense that would be the emblematic moment that would allow this inquiry to happen. That was our ambition with this exhibition. Not really to do a scientific or a historical overview, but let's say we thought of the Laboratorium exhibition as the laboratory itself, as the place of learning, and we knew we had to, as the laboratory has shown, reinvent the instrument of the exhibition. So that's a brief story.